I think Unique kind of left.
Oh, let's see. I don't have a number.
Yeah, she froze and then
she's coming back on. There you are. Okay, you're unfrozen. See you moving now, Unique.
Welcome back.
Yes, we are recording now. So I am here to make sure that you all get to talk about your projects, your works, etc. So you can tell me how you want this to go. I saw the last rundown. I think that Michelle, that you sent. The last rundown, yeah, that you and Trina sent about the follow-up, right? That you want to talk about your inspirations for the production of impact. You want to segue to Tony. Tony wants to talk about his advocacy work and education, etc. So you can tell me how you want this to go. I know that I'm supposed to ask some questions about the book, etc. But this is really, Corey didn't give me a lot of instructions. When you work with radical sociologists, they're often like, not the most detail oriented people, but but how you all want this to go is I'm here to provide you all, moderation for what you want.
All right. Sounds good.
Yep. Yeah. Michelle's always in charge.
Yeah, I mean, we had sort of come up with a loose format where, Trina and I would talk about like who we are as Newswrite and how we came about the idea of the blog and the process of working on it.
Sure.
And then and our goal.
Okay.
That we had for the book. And then from there, I mean, I can read a part of the introduction because that sort of summarizes.
I would love that. If you all want to get sort of like started, because it's recording, I'm giving, the editors like our real like start moment. Should we, I assume I'll ask you for introductions, etc. And you and I would love for you to read excerpts from the book. I can do that.
Yeah. And
so do you want us to introduce ourselves then?
Yes.
Okay.
We can start there. Please. Trina, please.
Oh. Let's just get started. Hi, I'm Trina Satira. I'm an associate professor of creative writing at College of DuPage. I'm also a writer. I wrote In Her Skin, Growing Up Trans, which is a young adult novel that was agented by Mark McVeigh. And Michelle and I have co-edited a couple of anthologies, et cetera, et cetera. So my activism work is through writing and publishing.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Michelle Duster, writer, speaker, public historian, educator. I teach at Columbia College, Chicago, and I didn't even realize that what I was doing was considered activism until somebody labeled me that way. And I'm like, really? And so what I've been doing that others have viewed, and now I'm starting to embrace the idea of activism is in the public history sphere. My great grandmother is Ida B. Wells, and I've been involved in numerous projects that help educate the public about her in the form of public history projects. So as far as street names, public historical markers, monuments, museums, exhibits, documentary films. I've worked in a lot of different mediums, and the whole idea is to take education outside of the classroom and into the public sphere. And so that's what I've been focusing on, not just only with my great grandmother, but with women's history and Black history, which is greatly undertold. And so between all of the individual work that I've been doing, plus Trina and I working on this book, Impact, that was our idea, and our goal was to continue having undertold, underrepresented stories be accessible.
Which is, great for us to put that in context, because we want to talk about the segue from what you all are doing to the advocacy that Tony is doing, that Unique is doing, and we want to get to those in a moment. Would you all like to tell us a bit about the project in terms of what was your goal in it? Because, things have been done about, Ida B. Wells before, and things have been done that have placed her in the context of this arc, particularly a type of anti-lynching and feminist, activism that was really the core of Reconstruction era, progressive era activism in Black communities. It wasn't like, feminism was over here. Like Black women were really driving the movement. Do you want to talk to us about the project and how it came together, and then maybe share something from it?
Right. Well, like I said, Trina and I, we were just talking one day a few years ago, when after the 2016 election, and and just kind of like what is going on in our country, and how are people reacting to this dynamic of of just what we had experienced, and realized that there are a number of ways that people are expressing their power, and taking control over their space, in the form of activism, which is not normally, doesn't get the same kind of attention that my great grandmother gets. Everybody talks about her. She's a historical icon. I mean, she's took on the world and made a huge impact, and she's in history books and all of that, which is wonderful. But I personally also feel that the kind of activism that people do on the local and grassroots level and institutional levels are equally important, and they don't get the same kind of recognition. And I personally feel that it takes a village to make a difference in society, not just like these one-off individual people. And so we wanted to give voice to those people who are not necessarily going to, have the kind of attention that my great grandmother has, but their stories need to be told and their voices need to be heard.
I think you all do that so well in this book. When I was reading it, like it's very accessible. I was like, oh, like I could like give this to my nephews to read, but it's not elementary, right? So it manages to actually discuss Black radicalism, FBI surveillance, it discusses, it puts Wells in the context of this large network of activists, which I think is so important, as you just said, to not talk about these biographies as one-offs, but to contextualize them in terms of the alliances they had with other Black communities, with other Black people, and to put them sort of inside of a cohort, which I think you do really, really well with Wells. In that, what do you think are some of the most important things that our readers, that sociologists, et cetera, need to understand about her in the context of her community and in the context of other activists? You talk about Trotter a lot. You talk about Du Bois. I mean, these are really important folks. Trotter is often ignored inside of, a lot of our historical analysis. I'd love to hear more.
So in the book Impact, Personal Portraits of Activism, the point of the book is to give voice to current people who are involved in activism in their own communities, and their own institutions. And we have two of the contributors here, Tony Bradburn and Unique Shaw, who have contributed pieces that talk about the work that they're doing right now in today, contemporary US history. And Trina and I both feel that's very important to document what's going on right now today, in the context of the social and political environment that we're living in right now. And so hopefully, they can talk about their work, and read excerpts of their essays, and we can kind of bring the story into what's going on today in 2021, as far as people making an impact on their environment, in their career, in their communities.
Absolutely. With that, I'd love, Tony or Unique, I'd love for you all to tell us sort of what you're doing and what you take of that spirit of building these very effective collective efforts around Black community advocacy.
Thank you. So my name's Tony Bradburn, and I feel a lot like Michelle. wherein I didn't necessarily think of myself as an activist. But I do remember kind of going back to Martin Luther King day off when I was sitting at home and I was legit watching Oprah. And I had the day off. I'm an educator. I'm watching Oprah. And she has a pretty regular show going on. And then she just stops and looks right into the camera. And she's like, look, I wouldn't be here right now if it weren't for Martin Luther King. And for me, that was one of those kind of jaw-dropping moments. Just appreciated her being humble and her saying, hey, you know what? I really wouldn't be here if it weren't for Martin Luther King. And then there was a little bit of a, tribute to him, and some of his words were shared. And I remember thinking, here I am, I'm teaching English at a high school of about 2,000 students. And I don't think we've said anything about Martin Luther King. The day off. And what are we doing to honor him and his work? And so I came back the next day and I sent an email to some of my colleagues and I said, look, I think we can do something. We can definitely do better than what we're doing now. And what if we all just shared our stories about how it is that we've addressed and confronted racism, and just see where it goes. And so got a group of people together and we just shared our stories. And each story was about 40 minutes long. And in doing that, it just became absolutely clear that our students wanted and needed to talk about race.
Yeah.
In time, we turned it over to them.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is where the power came in. It's when they said, hey, you know what? I want to share my story. I got something to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where the power really happened, I think.
So for both you and Unique, it's interesting that, we see this theme of folks who don't see themselves as activists and, until they're really doing the work. And I think that's actually really key to how a lot of Black politics have formed. It's not about people sort of labeling themselves something first. It's usually everyday people in communities who see something that needs to be done, who see an injustice, who get, politicized through the work, not because they necessarily branded themselves that, to begin with. Do you see that in terms of in your work and trying to communicate that to your students? Like, at the college level, we certainly see that. How do you think that translates though to the everyday, students in your communities, et cetera, who you see as doing these things before they even know, what they're really doing? You can put it into a scope of activism.
Well, absolutely. I think that it's fun to see, really. For example, at Niles North, we never had an Asian American Studies course. And I had a teacher come to me and he's like, hey, I want to start this course. And I said, all right, let's do it. And I haven't thought about it much for a couple of years. And all of a sudden the phone rang about a month ago and there was a journalist there and she said, hey, I heard that you helped start this course. And I said, yeah, I did. But like, why are you calling me? How do you know? And she said, well, listen, a bunch of your former students were at this protest and they're speaking up for Asian American Pacific Islander rights. And they said that they took this course and they said that you were a part of it. And, I said, really? I was shocked, So I don't think that those students in that moment thought that they were being activists. I think that they were just doing the next right thing. They're standing up and making sure that these issues were elevated and part of our, our dialogue. And so I think that it happens all the time where they just take one step towards doing something right. And then they take another and they take another. But Unique, maybe you have some other perspectives on that.
I want to hear from Unique and your perspective on it, in terms of, please first tell us, what you do and what your areas of activism and advocacy have been and how you really saw yourself coming into this space.
My name is Unique Shaw Smith and I'm a criminologist, sociologist, and I think it's interesting because when I think about activism, we often tell ourselves these stories about what ideas are, right? Or concepts are, and activism kind of gets put in this category and it has to look a certain way. And so all of us come to the table and we're like, well, we didn't really see ourselves as activism, but are activists, but it looks different. And I think that we have to break that box that we put activism in, because anytime that you take a stand or you do something that is to bring about political or social change, you're engaging in activism. And so it can be small and it can be major. It can be in the street, it can be in the classroom, it can be in conversation with people. And so really kind of bringing that up and helping students and colleagues and anyone else really understand that anytime that you really stand up to make a change, you're engaging in a form of activism. So for me in the classroom, my form of activism has first been being in the classroom as a Black woman, and showing up and being my authentic self and not shying away from who that is, or not trying to, kind of turn off or shift in a way to make other people feel comfortable. Because I think that as students, oftentimes they're used to having a certain type of teacher, and I'm not that. So on the first day of class, we engage in that and what that looks like. But also for me, largely as a criminologist who works with incarcerated people, it's often my form of activism centers on words and languages and stories that we use to tell about who people, places, or things are. And in my classroom, the first rule that we have is no dehumanizing language. And so from the jump, it's like, you can't call them felons, you can't call them prisoners, you can't call them convicts or whatever, because those are just labels that we use to separate us from other people. And so there's an unlearning process that has to happen. And that is a form of activism, because when you're able to relate to someone else and you see them as human and you start to see the similarities instead of the differences. And so when I teach, oftentimes, we'll go into the prisons or the jails or the juvenile halls and we get to interact with people. Part of why I'm here today is I worked with a group of students who worked with a group of incarcerated men to create an anthology, a poetry anthology, which is kind of similar, to Impact. But it was really a way for us to work together and be able to highlight that, yes, people are incarcerated, but they also create, they also want to contribute to our community. And they also do that in a way because they want to engage in some type of change, because they're engaging in internal change and they also want to contribute to change in the world too. So giving them a voice to tell their own story is really important. And that's all, in line with what we're trying to do in changing the social landscape.
It seems like, all of you have a real dedication and interest in bringing out folks from the margins into these spaces, because I think, one of the very, very, at least, what I study is often, Black leadership gets dictated through a gendered lens and through a class lens, in which it overwhelmingly becomes, one type of Black person, mostly straight Black men, middle class, et cetera. And while they deserve a place at the table, there's a way in which that dictates, Black, I'm sorry, someone, just a moment. Sorry, someone's at my door. That dictates, Black politics from that lens, right? From a class lens and from a straight lens and from a lens mostly of Black people who've had some semblance of power. It sounds like unique what you do and what Tony and what you do and what Michelle you're trying to emphasize in the book is that it's actually really important to bring in these experiences that are really hyper marginalized within communities. That in a way, it seems like there's a way in which you can only know the community by knowing who's the most marginalized in it. Is that accurate? I don't know who wants to take that, but go ahead.
In the entire anthology of Impact, we have a lot of different voices. There are 45 different contributors, and so there are different stories and different people who are represented. And we have a Native American woman. We have some people even from outside of the United States. So our goal with the book overall was, like you said, to give a voice to people who many times are overlooked or marginalized. And the work that they're doing doesn't necessarily make the headlines when it comes to how, what's uplifted in our society. But we feel that they are very important, because you have to work at a micro level in order to make macro level change. I mean, so overall, that's what the book is about. But the work that that Tony and Unique, do is very specific to sort of educational, institutional change, and working within. Well, you can speak better for what you're doing than I can, but there are specific communities that each individual person is impacting in different ways. But the overall umbrella is that most of the people are working in ways that, on behalf of people who tend to not, like I said, get a lot of the attention, who tend to be exploited.
Yeah.
When you think about the history of our country, like who gets built on, or whose labor is used for other people's profit,
Right.
and
Right.
all of these type of issues that we as a culture really do need to talk about.
Mhm.
And I think that's our goal. And Trina can speak to that, as far as the goal of the book is to help start dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a conversation that's emerging right now is the idea that publishing is not always publishing marginalized voices.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
and they're focusing on the celebrity and
Yeah.
how they can make the most money off of that book. And so, like Unique's project, this project includes people that aren't celebrities, but they have lost time and money and dedication and free, any of their, free time even for the cause, right? They've showed up every single time. They've
Yeah.
gone to City Hall,
Yeah.
they've written letters. And so that's what, this book captures, right? Is we aren't, society is not paying attention to the real work because they're only given the celebrity, the celebrity perspective. And so, that's something we wanted to celebrate, in this text is there's a lot to celebrate too.
Yeah, that's such an important point because you bring to mind that it's not just that people are sort of voiceless by some lack of design. It's really deliberately that we tend to re-amplify the same people, often who are not really in the ground game of this type of work. And in that, we also lose a lot of sight of what's actually happening on the ground, right? So literally, I just had a colleague bring the term to my vocabulary today of what you call them, infotainment, right? Infotainment, the type of I call them social justice climbers, in terms of there's a way in which you become a celebrity by being associated with these movements in any sort of loose way. You can literally just put it in your Instagram bio. But what's really lost is that on the ground game, people are doing, Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper, right? She wasn't doing it for anything to be cute. She didn't get a stylist. She wasn't like doing any of this. She did it because her life was on the line in Mississippi to be in these movements or not. I think you all bring to the fold how important it is to amplify those of us who really are on the front lines and who really have more skin in the game, right? You all are really amplifying people in this book for whom they're in these communities. They haven't left them. They're not writing from the ivory tower. They're in these places. They are, entrenched family ties, community ties, economic ties, et cetera. And how do you think that changes, one, the contribution of this book? And what do you think is really left out, in the state of who we, currently amplify, who we currently publish? What do you think is left out in how we discuss activism if it's disconnected from the authors like you all have featured?
Can I speak to that?
Please.
One of the things that I really appreciated about the opportunity to be a part of this anthology was the fact that, as an academic, there's requirements when you publish, especially in academic journals or any other type of, thing that's going to count towards tenure. Mm-hmm. And really what they want you to do is to write like everyone else. And so the opportunity to participate in this anthology was allowed us to engage in our own creative ways that we write and tell our story and share what we want to say in the way that we would normally share it before it gets edited or watered down or say, you can't say it that way. And so I know for me, and I have a co-author for the piece that we contributed to this book, we spent a lot of time in discussion about that, you know, why we wanted to actually submit to an anthology like this, what it would do for us. And then we talked a lot about what we called it poetic activism meant to us, you know, and the ability to share our own personal narratives, because that is our truth. And in a lot of ways, people's truths get written out of history, you know, and you have people who are on the ground who are doing the work. And when they share their version of events, it's often called, what do they call it? A conspiracy theory, you know,
Right.
to what mainstream
Right.
media is telling about it. And it's not, but that personal narrative is really critical in telling the truth and history from the perspective of people who are on the ground and who have that lived experiences.
Yeah.
And we also talked about Stokely Carmichael, and he said that people should have the ability to define themselves as they see fit and to organize themselves as they see fit. So as two Black women who came together to write this piece, you know, one as a faculty and one as a PhD student, it was really a way for us to use our voice against these systemic issues that create like disparate impacts on us, or ways to kind of exclude us from being able to also show up in the academic field in the way that we should with our own type of voice. And so we really appreciated the opportunity to be here because it allowed us to reclaim our rightful space in our own story as people who occupy a space on the campus as well, you know, and who are dealing with struggles that other people may not see, but we can't always voice in the way that is our own, I guess, our own voice.
You know,
So,
you think you and I probably have, you know, as academics, we know the experience of how activism, to us, it's a great word, but in our field, it's really still a dirty word. It's kind of like, you know, being called an activist judge, right? That's like it's a disparaging comment that you make about someone. And I wanted to hear from you all in terms of, you know, we see activism as essential to bring about change, but then we also have to talk about the backlash to it, right? And in your professions, et cetera, how being called an activist, being labeled an activist, or even being associated with activism, in many ways, there are penalties for that in our professions, you know, in spheres where we, you know, operate. And can you all speak on that and sort of how you navigate that? I mean,
because I have a funny story. As I was tenure track at an institution that I'm no longer with anymore. But, you know, when I came, I talked about, you know, just being myself. And I always describe myself as unapologetic. Like, this is what you get when you get me, you know, and I'm just going to be authentically myself. And when I came to campus, that's who I was. And I just kind of hit the ground running. And just like activism, this whole idea of radical, you know, people,
right.
radical is good, but bad at the same time. But really, when you understand what it means, it's really just getting down to the root of it. So I was kind of viewed as this radical person on campus, and a lot of tenured people were telling me, you know, you probably should kind of water it down a little bit, step lightly. And for me, it was kind of like, well, I want them to know what they're getting if they do decide to give me tenure. And if they don't decide to give me tenure, then this is not where I'm supposed to be, you know, but I'm not going to change who I am. And then later when I get tenure, be like, surprise, you know, this is really who I am. Because that's not fair to the students. And that's why we end up with a lot of people who shouldn't have tenure, is because they've just been flying under the radar for a very long time. So I think that just showing up and being myself has been a form of activism in a lot of ways. But I'm okay with the penalties that come with that, because I don't think that I want to fit into these boxes that they're trying to put me in. And it's not going to serve me. It's not going to serve the institutions that we work at. It's ultimately not going to serve the students that we serve either, because we would be reinforcing the idea that you have to be something different in order to be successful. And that's not true.
Absolutely. You know, and it's good to, you know, hear about the penalties. I'd like to hear from, you know, Michelle and Trina and Tony about, you know, what you all see as, you know, the sort of the sacrifices you make to stay true to advocacy, to stay true to, you know, your politics, really. I mean, you know, in academia, I think this is the first time in academia where I have felt like I can talk about Palestine without being, like, I expect to be penalized to talk about a free Palestine. I think this year is the first time I felt like I could actually do that openly and then basically dare someone to challenge me about my views on a free Palestine, right? But those are, like Unique said, the penalties that we sort of expect and accept when we navigate these spaces. I'd love to hear from you all your thoughts on, you know, sort of how you have negotiated that.
Well, I think that in some ways, when we think about, you know, what's happened over the last 16 months or so, it has helped, like you're saying. So we were all remote when George Floyd died, and then Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. And as a result of being remote, I decided to start a more civic group. And so I started a group called Activists for Racial Equity out in Crystal Lake, which is where I live. And in that group now, we're about 900 people strong. Yet I was nervous. Thing y'all saying, I was nervous. I'm like, oh man, you know.
Nervous that you would have like informants in there, or like.
Right, because there are like community members from where I work, which is about, you know, 35, 40 minutes away, who, you know, I don't know what they're thinking, you know. And
True.
so for me, I just felt convicted though. And I said, I have to do this. I need to do this. Our community needs to be talking about these issues. And they weren't isolating race. They weren't, they're just talking about like injustice. And, you know, I just felt like we need to racialize these conversations. We need to make sure that these white folk out by where I live are understanding that this is about race. This is about racism. This is about the 4 levels, you know, of racism, not just, you know, this interpersonal racism, and that there's more to it than, you know, just, hey, this person called me a derogatory term. Right. So people out by me, they weren't really understanding about that. And so I just said, well, forget it. I don't want to be in your groups where you're talking about all this stuff. So I'm just going to start my own. And the premise of it all is that we're going to isolate race in these conversations. And we're going to confidently say Black Lives Matter. And if you can't say that, then there's other groups.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is an interesting, you know, question. You know, a lot of what you all do in this book is not just amplifying activists, but also educating folks on what these issues are. And in terms of that, you know, there can be, there's sometimes a challenge, right? So if you go into a community and you say your lived experience is absolutely expertise, is absolutely knowledge, and then what I want to do is bring a sort of a more eagle-eye view to like why your life has been, you know, how it is, things that you might know about the system larger and structurally. And I think that that's really important in getting people to understand what their activism is about, right? That connecting it past, you know, oh, like my experience in this community is related to the carceral state, and like those things are interdependent. And so what have you all really sort of committed yourselves to in terms of the education you have to do around your activism too? Please, anyone.
I would say, I mean, this is not in the book because Trina and I were very deliberate about letting the contributors speak versus us having, you know, too much of, you know, of us in it. We wanted to kind of step back and let other and give people an opportunity to speak. But I'll just say what's not in the book, as far as my own particular activism, when you're talking about sort of educating people or advocating for certain things that you feel are super important. I can say, like, I mean, I've been involved in, like I said, all these different projects about my great grandmother, and so in advocating for these public kind of tributes to her, there has been sort of a lot of fighting. I don't want to, maybe persuading versus fighting people to understand that a Black woman needs to be recognized by the entire population. Not just a Black woman needs to be recognized by Black people.
Yes, absolutely.
but a Black woman needs to be recognized by everyone. And this sort of effort to kind of compartmentalize our history and our contributions into these small boxes, and only Black people should celebrate Black people, has
Yeah.
been behind the scenes struggle
Yeah.
on my
Yeah.
part to push forward and to fight for a Black woman to be front and center in the most public way
Yeah.
in the city of Chicago, in spaces that some people want to sort of insinuate
Yeah.
that Black people
Yeah.
don't deserve to be.
Yeah.
And, so that's been sort of my sort of behind the scenes activism of like, no, you're not going to marginalize again. But then at the same time, there's also on the flip side, a push to make sure that our communities, predominantly Black communities, have the right to have something nice. Because, there were some, when it comes to the monument, some people tried to insinuate that, well, maybe that should be in another neighborhood, because they felt like that was a nice project.
Oh,
And
so it was too nice of a monument to be in a Black neighborhood.
exactly. Yes. And I'm like, no, you're not going to tell me that something that our community doesn't deserve,
Right.
something high quality, highly visible, beautiful. What are you trying to say? So it's like this double-edged sword of like, on the one hand, you don't deserve to be in these, highly visible spaces because you're Black, and so you go over there. But then on the other side, when we want to do something, when we're advocating to have something nice in our communities, like, well, that's too nice for you people. So this is, this underlying message that I think we all, have experienced, is this sort of, way of placing value on who we are as a people and who our experiences, should be affected, and who gets to celebrate and who doesn't get to celebrate, and who gets to speak for you, and who do you get to speak for yourself. There's a lot of dynamics, that are involved in these things, and so, and I think, again, that's what I think Trina and I were trying to do with the book, is to make it possible for people to speak for themselves. Because there's a constant, sort of battle of other people, experts, talking about somebody else's experience, versus letting the people talk about their own experiences.
Yes. Yes. With that, I really want to give you all space, Unique. You would probably have no problem answering this question in terms of, as academics, we often, particularly I think Black academics, much like Wells and her peers, are often trapped between this, discipline, this establishment that, has one type of idea of how to study our people. And then what we often do is, we're kind of, Black scholars are kind of activists by default, if you're doing Blackness right, I would say. And that you are constantly arguing for the humanity of Black people. You're constantly arguing against the subjectivity of Black people and being treated as sort of, research object without their own agency. And, but this is, even till this day, if you want to have an amazing career as a sociologist, be a white person who studies poor Black people and make some sort of sensational type of ethnography about their lives, right? That, to this day, that is the way you will become a celebrity sociologist. And so, what you all remind me of is, where we often lie at these intersections. Michelle, you and your biography, I find very fascinating, because you really inundated in this as a child in terms of, being from Chicago, and you talk about I've heard you talk about your father's career, being in this scope of understanding that part of what you just do in a community, you talk about your mother as well, is is actually doing the work of these things. And that to you doesn't sound like it was a contradiction or a tension between, you know, your professional life and your actual politics and your actual principles. We often, you know, as academics exist in a world where the profession is fighting back against the principles. I want to know, you know, with that, what sort of critique, what sort of feedback would you like to give to the scholarly community in terms of what it actually has a duty to do when talking about communities, when talking about human beings in these communities?
I know for me personally, one of the critiques that I've always had of like academic institutions is, you know, I went to a program where we had some like heavy hitters in terms of publishing. And I overheard a conversation one day where, and not necessarily people in the department, but just amongst colleagues, you know, who were kind of going into the field, like, oh, well, she's going to a teaching college, you know, so we won't hear from her anymore. And this focus on just pumping out research, you know, we need research, but I've always felt that there's a disconnect between what we actually research and how it's going to help people.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
yeah. Back and we're reading it as other academics in the field, but how is it actually being implemented? Whose hands is it going into to actually make a change? Because then, you know, when I go into the prison and I'm interacting with people who are incarcerated, I come in and they think that I'm just another person who wants to collect data from them and write an article. And so it took me a very long time to build rapport with the people that I was working with and for them to understand that I was truly there because I wanted to share resources with them. And so because of that disconnect where we actually don't see change happening in the communities that are just kind of being observed and written about and talked about, and we understand them, but we're not helping them. When people do come in and they want to affect change, it's kind of like, are you just like everyone else? And so I would say that that's my biggest critique is what are we going to do and how are we actually going to take what we know and implement it? Because for you know, centuries in this country, we have had information about the root causes of crime, about poverty, about education, and we've been presented with that and we're like, oh, well, we're not going to address it. You know, we put band-aids on it. And I don't think that we should be able to collect data about people if we're not actually going to put something in place to help alleviate some of those issues.
I absolutely. And I think for many of our professions, there's a disconnect between the way a white establishment approaches it, which is there's no obligation to improve anyone's lives, right? That there's almost a the point of what many of our disciplines do in in academia is to improve the field, but not the people the field studies. Tony, please, you seem like you have an opinion on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple things are coming together for me now. So the one is the idea of, you know, hey, basically, what is it that I'm doing to keep sharp, you know, and keep my passions high?
Yeah.
It is really just about being in spheres of activists and organizers. And one thing that recently kind of went across my desk was this article really just spoke to the idea that colleges and universities don't value organizing. So they don't think of that as something that's professional.
They almost disparage it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why I was nervous for starting that organization. I'm like, oh man, I got to keep this quiet, right? But the reality of it is that I shouldn't be. In fact, it ought to be part of the academic canon that, hey, this is important work. Whether you write this nice article and submit it to, you know, whatever journal or magazine, well, that's great. Well, is it really changing lives? You know, are we really building community? Are we really strengthening our ties and our relationships? Are we really uplifting those who we know need to be amplified? So I think that part of what I want to be working on is just that, is to make sure that when we kind of codify what's valued in terms of professional contributions, that one of those pieces is about organizing, and that is valuable. And we want our academics doing that. And it, in fact, is probably more important than writing some articles or some, you know, novels. And I think that we need to be explicit about that. It needs to be written into, you know, what it is that we say is professional, and at every college and university in the country, frankly. So I know of at least one other place that's doing that, and I think that more need to follow.
You know, that really, you know, that could really change a trajectory because, you know, as you know, well, you know, the tenure thing is based on three things, you know, is teaching, research, and service. And that service thing has never meant service to a people. It means service to the discipline. It means professional service. It has never meant service to a community. It has never meant service to anyone marginalized. It's never meant service. If I went and I taught at, you know, one of our state correctional facilities, misnomer, that would count for nothing. But to me, that's the most important teaching I would ever do in my life, right? I think, you know, you make a huge point about how we actually bring activism into the idea of that this isn't, you know, activism shouldn't be marginalized, right? And it certainly shouldn't be disconnected from what we have to do professionally. You know, the history of, you know, Wells, of Du Bois, of E. Franklin Frazier, who I have minor critiques of all these folks, is that they were scholar activists. And in fact, there was no way in which you could ask them to disconnect the two. And what we have asked many of our scholars to do is really divorce from that. And we do it systemically, right? Like as you know, discussed, we do it by penalizing that, by not having a way of valuing it, by saying this is, scholarship is, is when you're not engaged in community. Scholarship is when you don't advocate on anyone's behalf, because that's objective. And we're all striving for objectivity. But very interesting that you all really turned that on its head, I think, with the book. And then, for your, students you work with, et cetera, how do you see them changing in terms of trying to marry those two? In terms of the professional and the activist.
I mean, I suppose I can speak to that. I just had a student about a year ago. I teach a social justice course it's an honors composition course, and I teach Wells, and I was teaching Kevin Coble, a poet who writes about the city of Chicago and gentrification. I was teaching Howard Zinn, and he wrote a beautiful piece on race realism, and he's from Ireland. And his piece received a lot of downloads, I think over 2,000 downloads. He was asked to present at Johns Hopkins, and he's a community college student, right, who is in an honors program, so this is like an other kind of group to begin with, right, this open enrollment place. And so I do believe that teacher activism can occur without us. We do have to walk that line of do we want to be employed or not, right? So maybe I can't come out and say I'm a teacher activist on day one at a community college, because I've been told that I need to service both viewpoints in our society, meaning political. And so, and I've been told that we're too loud in the classroom. And so we've been asked to teach to everyone because they're all paying to be there. But the way I skirt it is through the texts that I use. And then those texts create those conversations, and those conversations create those papers, and those papers create the national conversation, right? And so there's a way to do it. It's a fine line we walk, right? And when we talk about being public about our activism and really putting that hard work out, like Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I know Michelle can definitely speak to this, she just wrote an article about it, but then we lose our employment. We're declined entry to begin with. Absolutely. I mean, I think Jones is a really good example in terms of someone who actually, I mean, you could call it activism, but that activism was also based in the scholarship, right? Like she was actually drawing on real scholarship. And in that sense, I think activism becomes this weapon to use against folks who is like, no, what you're calling activism is actually just me countering your extremely white supremacist worldview, right? Your extremely narrow worldview. You're actually doing the activism by limiting a worldview, right?
It actually took a lot of active action to create these universities, create these spaces as white supremacists serving. That's the activism, right? It's denying, I mean, Jim Crow was activism. White people fought tooth and nail to keep us out of everything, right? So I think it's very interesting now that, you know, you're talking about, Trina, sort of this fine line in which we walk, but we're also at a point where just telling the truth is seen by many as political. And we're like, but this is actually just established, you know, intersubjectively established consensus in a field, right?
For sure. Right. When we try to make the narrative the counter narrative, right, then we're lying. Or a conspiracy, right? We're teaching a conspiracy,
Which, you know, I think that's, you know, one of the reasons that we push back upon this, you know, false narrative of in sociology, we call it positivism, which is a belief that you can be completely objective. But that wasn't objective. That was white men saying that what they knew to be true was true for the world, and they called it objectivity. And so when you have Wells come along and say, well, actually, lynching is a matter of economic and social competition, it's not a matter of this myth of black male sexual predation, then that was called activism. But what she actually did was data, right? He was the original criminologist. And in fact, I'm very passionately feel that the field needs to make clear that Wells is the original criminologist, because she was talking about unpunished crime. She was talking about the original crime of state violence and white violence. Unpunished crime is the history of crime in this country.
One thing I wanted to kind of mention is I think Tony's essay really captured not only his own activism, but the activism of the students. You know, because Tony, you can speak better than I can about what you wrote about, but I was really inspired by your piece, because you talked about how these kids would come to you with their ideas. So it's almost like the next generation of activism, and the kids taking control over their own environment and their own space.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. There are a couple of moments in life that have helped like affirm my path. You know how sometimes you're just doing things and you're like, I don't know if I'm really doing the right thing. Right. But then there's these affirmations. And so one of them came kind of out of the blue. There was this woman who had been a former student of mine, and she just posted something on social media, and she's like, look, I don't talk to a lot of you much anymore, but you know what? I want to tell you something that I'm proud of you, she said. And I wrote this in my piece. You're good people and stand up for what's right. And it's showing now more than ever. Mm-hmm. Moved and strangely relieved, she continues, because so many others I've met along the way have disappointed me so much in what they've chosen to share and what matters to them. Mm-hmm. RMHS kids, Rolling Meadows High School kids, keep being the good in this world. I think our teachers had a lot to do with this. Looking at you, Tony Bradburn, Black Lives Matter. And yeah, it's just like, hey, look at that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Heard from her in a minute, you know, and she did that. And then, so that was just affirming. It's like, all right, so I did some good stuff. So Unique Shaw, you keep teaching, okay? You don't need to be writing. Teaching, keep changing the world, and we'll be hearing from you, all right? So, and then the other thing that comes up for me is that I just decided to get all the black kids, all the black boys together at my school for lunch and for breakfast twice a month. And I wasn't sure that was a good idea either. I wasn't sure, like, hey, am I only going after kids who've had discipline referrals or kids, you know, in a certain GPA? I was just like, forget it. You all just come and right. I'll just do it. And so we got together. And after that first meeting, towards the end of it, I said, hey, how often do you want to do this? And one of the students responded and he said, every day, let's do it tomorrow.
They've been waiting for it.
I was like, well, I don't know if I'm ready for that. I love y'all, but I got another job. So anyways, we landed on twice a month, and they were, of course, grateful and thankful. But that again was another affirmation, like, hey, you doing the right thing. Like, let's just get Black people together and have lunch, breakfast. But the fruits of that is that I had some students come to me just because I built relationships with them. And they said, I had a teacher who said the N-word, and she was reading it, so it was from a historical text.
Right.
But still, you know what, Mr. Bradburn, it just didn't feel right. It just didn't feel right. And I don't think she should say it. And had we never built that relationship, they never would have even known who I was, right? They'd have just been like, oh, he's just this Black guy walking down the hall. Like, I don't know what he does or, anything. But they knew I was the humanities director, and they knew that I was in charge of those English teachers and social science teachers, and they talked to me about it. And through a number of conversations, I just went back to the department. I'm like, guys, we're done. Can't, just period. We can't say it. And they got it. And then I went to the PE department because they were listening to music. The kids had the ability to plug into the jack. And of course, they had some songs that, of course, had the N-word in it. And so I talked to them, and they said, all right, well, yeah, we can't have that anymore. Like, we're gonna turn that off and not give them that access. And so I think that's activism, them standing up to me and, standing up to the department and saying, hey, we got to change here. But also they knew that I was going to listen, that I cared about them, and that what they had to say mattered. And frankly, I wouldn't even have known that had happened, in the classroom, had they not came and talked to me about it. And so it was beautiful. And I do agree that they just become stronger. They become the people that we want them to be, by us being who it is that we authentically are.
Yeah. We are, we've gone to an hour. I want to close with us, Tony, you leave us on a really good note in terms of, in the book that you all have read, each other's stories now, and, certainly the editors have read everybody's. What do you see as those affirming moments that you draw from the book? What in the stories of people actually doing this work, what have you all taken away as like, oh, like that's what it is for me, right? Like, that's a moment when I know that this work matters. That's a moment when I saw, Tony, you're talking about the smallest things of like individual students affirming you. What do you all see, from the book? What have the authors told you all about sort of what keeps them confirmed and affirmed in doing the work?
Unique, you ought to just read your piece, because that's
please. Yeah.
When I first read that, I was like, this is gorgeous. Like,
Please.
That's what I just sent in the chat. I just asked her, I'm like, can you please read your piece? I love it so much. So I'm sorry.
And we've been, and this is my apologies. We've been meaning to read your pieces anyway. Sorry, I've forgotten at the top of the hour. That's what we were supposed to do. Please, Unique.
Sure, I would love to. So I do want to call attention to the fact that this piece is co-authored by who is now Dr. Shantae Steele. And so we worked on it together. And it's an excerpt from a larger piece, and it's called Activism. And it's our stories about occupying space on campus as Black women in different roles. So me as a faculty member, her as a PhD student. The embodiment of a movement is not always public, not always organized, or even intentional in manner, mind, body, or spirit. A collective inertia of morale manifesting in the day-to-day lives of people who exist in places where they are not always welcomed and embraced. Activism in academia is oftentimes a presence of being in the room and sharing a perspective that would not otherwise be voiced. It is in the sharing of struggle, fable, or spirit-filled songs to muster the courage to stand, feet firmly planted in the face of Father Time, whether real or imagined. The implications are not fabricated as many livelihoods fall prey in the passing of midnight hours. Stopped watch ticking time bombs of action, erupt in command of voice, in plans of strategy, in beating of shared heart drums, passionate martyrs armed with resistance in the name of solidarity. Justice is a revolutionary war. Clenched fist raised high with doctorate degree in hand, battles waged against the mind in classroom where supremacy never sleeps. Activism occupies seats reserved for the privileged majority, challenging generationally imparted beliefs with scholarship written by hands their ancestors exploited. Versed in patriarchal gibberish, deconstructing isms when I speak, I am the verb the colonizers wrote manuals of instructions to quell. In the ranks of those they built ivory towers to defeat, stumbling in to infiltrate the hallmark of elitist construction. Assembly lines of production disrupted by an Ebonic speaking Black woman professor. Enchanted Black women who bore life on a 200-pound bale of cotton, spent hours cooking for the master with his tools only to come home and create dishes out of the belly of the beast, something out of nothing. Became wise and knowledgeable when the world considered her feeble-minded and dull. It is in the DNA of Black women to supernaturally step outside of self, find fortitude, and then pilgrimage across battlefields of dictatorship, domination, and despotism, while simultaneously fighting against external forces of supremacy and racism that attempt to give voice to doubt, to internalized hate, nursing Black women back to loving images of their diverse self. It is in the DNA of Black women to stand up for human rights, selfless in support of the cause for others, while still 3/5 whole in her own land, reckless in pursuit of justice for all, knowing equity frequently slips through her own hand. It is in the DNA to arrive the best version of myself, kinked out with cornrow crowns, creating spaces for new images of young, educated Black women, aware that my endeavor to get past the doctoral gates and into the 2% is a precursor to a war only Black women faculty can prepare me for. So I seek others with similar patterns of DNA, enchanted Black women who occupy the academy, despite the blood, sweat, and tears shed, carving the way for my critique. So that was, a collaboration of our experiences kind of being on campus and what that means to us, knowing that just being there,
Yes.
something.
Yeah, it reminds me of the point of we call it activism as though you have to do something. The existence in many of these white spaces is resilience and stuff like that. Is like just being there is an affront to them. So it's like we don't have to do anything from that point to be seen as activists. Our being there is an affront to whatever status quo they've tried to establish. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to give others an opportunity to also wrap up. I think you all, were there other pieces you wanted to share from the book as well? With that, I cannot think of a higher note to end on. That was such a powerful piece to read. Thank you, Nick. It's been really a pleasure speaking to you all today. Really, thank you for doing this work. Trina, you just reminded me so much of we do exist in a time where there is a, celebrification, to invent a word, of this type of thing. And it's so important to get back to what our ancestors were doing, which was, Ivy Wells was the most famous Black woman of her day, bar none, but that wasn't her goal, or she only used it in service of the cause, not in service of herself. All right. Thank you all for really being here today, for sharing. This has been, it's really fed me.
Well, I just wanted to thank you, say, how do you pronounce your name?
Saida, sorry, Saida, yes.
I wanted to thank you for having us, and I really want to thank Unique Shaw-Smith and Tony Bradburn for believing in us enough to contribute to, because you didn't know us. None of the contributors knew us, and so for them to see our call for submissions and believe in the vision of the work, and us as Trina and I as professionals to contribute your beautiful work. I mean, we are very honored that you decided to become, part of to be part of this project.
Absolutely. Thank you. And really thanks to all the contributors. Yeah, I think this really, it puts the power back into the hands of the people who are really in this work and the people who are really in communities. And, to me, that is the point. That is the point, is to put the power back to the people.
Thank you so much for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Thank you, guys. It has been wonderful. Enjoy Chicago and Hawaii. I will try to not sound bitter. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Goodbye, guys.
Bye.